January 6, 1944. 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. Major General Jimmy Doolittle stood in the office of Major General William Kieptener, commander of the 8th Fighter Command, when something on the wall caught his attention. A sign hung prominently above Kieptener's desk, its message clear and simple. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive. Doolittle read it twice, then turned to Kieptener. "That sign needs to come down," he said quietly. "It is wrong." Within hours, a new sign replaced it. The first duty of 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. This moment would mark one of the most important tactical decisions of World War II. A complete reversal of fighter doctrine that would shatter the Luftwaffe within weeks. What bomber crews initially called suicide, and what some commanders labeled reckless, would prove to be the strategic masterstroke that won air supremacy over Europe. The mathematics of aerial warfare were about to be rewritten not just through technological innovation, but through one general's willingness to sacrifice old doctrine for real results. The crisis had been building for months. On October 14, 1943, 291 American B-17 bombers launched the second raid on Schweinfurt, deep in the heart of Germany. The target was very important: ball-bearing plants that produced parts essential for German war production. The Americans reached the target and dropped their bombs with deadly accuracy. But the cost was huge. 60 bombers failed to return. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. 600 men dead or missing in a single afternoon. American bomber crews faced odds that made completing a required 25-mission tour almost impossible. During the worst times of 1942 and 1943, survival rates fell to between 25 and 35%. Lieutenant Robert Morgan, pilot of the famous Memphis Belle, one of the few crews to complete their tour, wrote in his diary that night, "We are being slaughtered. The fighters turn back at the German border, and we fly on alone into hell. The forts protect themselves well, but it is not enough. We need the fighters to go all the way with us, or we need to stop flying." The German fighters had developed very deadly tactics. They would form up far beyond the range of Allied escort fighters, then attack in large groups. Head-on passes through bomber formations, where closing speeds went over 600 mm, gave American gunners only seconds to react. Fighters with 30 mm cannons and air-to-air rockets could destroy a B-17 with just one hit. The problem was simple. American escort fighters, P-38s and P-47 Thunderbolts, did not have the range to go all the way with the bombers to distant targets. Over Schweinfurt, the escorts had turned back 300 miles from the target. The bombers continued alone, fighting for their lives against German fighters that could attack freely. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the United States Army Air Forces, gave an ultimatum in December 1943. Unless the German Air Force is destroyed, Operation Overlord, the planned invasion of Normandy, cannot happen. American bombers cannot keep taking such heavy losses. Find a solution, or the strategic bombing campaign ends. The solution came in November 1943, in the form of a shiny silver fighter that would change everything. The North American P51 Mustang, powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, producing 1,695 horsepower at war emergency power, had abilities that seemed almost impossible. With drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers 1,600 miles to any target in Germany and back. It flew at 437 ft/t, faster than any German fighter. At high altitude, where thin air hurt most engines, the Mustang's two-stage supercharged Merlin worked perfectly. The fighter could reach 41,000 feet and fight well at heights where Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs struggled. Captain Chuck Yeager, flying P-51s with the 357th Fighter Group, described the aircraft's impact in his combat report. The P-51 is faster, climbs better, and turns tighter than anything the Germans have. For the first time, we have a plane that can go anywhere the bombers go and fight when we get there. This changes everything. But having the range to escort bombers all the way to the target was only half the solution. How the escorts were used in combat would decide victory or defeat. Under the old rules, fighters flew in tight groups around the bomber streams, always staying within sight of the bombers. If German fighters attacked, American escorts would fight them, but only long enough to drive them away before returning to close formation. The priority was always to defend. This defensive approach caused a deadly problem. German pilots could pick when and where to attack. They gathered far away, dove through the bomber formation at full speed, caused damage, then escaped before American fighters could fight back effectively. The escorts reacted to the Germans, but never took the fight to them. Major General Ira Yeager, the old commander of 8th Air Force, had made this defensive rule official. Yeager, a bomber pilot himself, truly believed that bombers could defend themselves with overlapping machine gun fire. Fighters were only there to help, not replace that protection. Jimmy Doolittle saw things differently. Doolittle was not a bomber pilot. He was a fighter pilot, a test pilot, and a racing champion. And he had a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT. He understood how planes performed in ways few others did. More importantly, he understood how tactics worked in real fights. The raid that made Doolittle famous, the April 18, 1942 strike on Tokyo by 16 B-25 bombers launched from the carrier Hornet, had been bold, technically difficult, and strategically brilliant. Doolittle got the Medal of Honor for personally leading that mission. Now he led the 8th Air Force with a clear order from General Arnold. Solve the fighter problem. On January 6, 1944, his first full day in command, Doolittle met General Kiaptaner and gave his revolutionary order. Fighters would no longer stay close to bombers to defend them. Instead, they would fly ahead of the bomber stream up to 50 miles forward and 25 miles to each side, actively hunting German fighters. After the bombers finished their attacks and turned for home, American fighters would not go back with them. Instead, they would sweep across Germany at low altitude, strafing airfields, destroying planes on the ground, and attacking trains and fuel depots. The goal was not just to protect bombers, but to completely destroy the Luftwaffe. The order shocked American fighter pilots and scared bomber crews. Colonel Donald Blakeslee, commander of the famous 4th Fighter Group, understood right away. "This is what we have been asking for," he told his pilots. "Freedom to hunt. We are no longer shepherds guarding sheep. We are wolves." But Lieutenant Colonel Jim Howard, operations officer of the 350 34th Fighter Group, explained the bomber crew's view. "The men flying the forts and liberators think we are abandoning them. They believe fighters leaving them alone to hunt Germans elsewhere is madness. They do not understand that killing German fighters before they reach the bombers is better protection than shooting them down after they attack." The bomber crew's fears were not crazy. They had survived missions only because fighters stayed close, driving off attackers. Now those fighters would vanish over the horizon, leaving bombers apparently defenseless. Many crews thought Doolittle's order was a death sentence written by a general who did not understand their war. The German reaction to the new American tactics would either prove or destroy Doolittle's gamble. For the Luftwaffe, the winter of 1943–44 had seemed like they were winning the air war. Even after 3 years of Allied bombing, German fighter production had actually grown. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf factories were producing over 1,000 fighters every month. German pilots had learned very effective tactics against American formations. The heavily armed Sturzbach Focke-Wulf, 190 fighters, carrying big cannons in underwing pods, could destroy bombers with a single attack. These were escorted by faster Messerschmitt 109 fighters, whose job was to tie up American escorts while the Sturzbachs massacred the bombers. Major General Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, believed the Luftwaffe was winning the battle of attrition. In November 1943, he reported to Reich Marshal Hermann Göring that American bomber losses could not continue. "If we keep this pressure," he wrote, "the Americans will have to stop daylight bombing by spring." But Galland's analysis had a deadly blind spot. He focused on how many planes Germany was building while ignoring how many pilots were dying. Germany was building fighters faster than the Allies could destroy them on the ground or in factories. But Germany could not replace experienced pilots fast enough to make up for the ones killed in combat. In 1943, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 3,000 fighter pilots killed, wounded, or missing. Training for new pilots was cut from 250 hours to 150 hours to meet demand. New German pilots were entering combat with barely enough skill to fly their planes, let alone fight well against experienced American aviators. Feldwebel Hans Dammers, a Messerschmitt 109 pilot with 8 victories, wrote to his brother in January 1944 about the problem. "The new pilots last 3, maybe 4 missions before they are killed. They do not know how to dogfight. They cannot work with their wingmen. They freeze when attacked. We veterans must protect them while also fighting the Americans. It is becoming impossible." The weather in early 1944 delayed the test of Doolittle's new tactics. Winter storms kept bombers grounded for days at a time. But on January 29th, when over 800 bombers launched against Frankfurt, the new American fighter tactics were used for the first time. P51 Mustangs from the 357th Fighter Group roared ahead of the bomber stream at 28,000 feet, flying in loose formations that gave maximum visibility and time to react. They were not tied to specific bomber boxes. Instead, they hunted wherever German fighters might appear. Near Bonn, the American fighters spotted a formation of 50 Messerschmitt 109s climbing to attack the bombers. Instead of waiting for the Germans to strike, the Mustangs dove on them. The Germans, expecting to attack bombers easily, suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against fighters with better speed and altitude. The combat lasted 8 minutes. 13 German fighters fell. 2 Mustangs were damaged, but both returned to base. The remaining German formations scattered and never reached the bombers. Captain Don Blakeslee, leading the 4th Fighter Group on a similar mission that day, described the effect of the new tactics. "We caught 20 Focke-Wulfs forming up over Cologne. They were slow, heavy with ammunition and fuel, climbing to attack the bombers. We had speed, altitude, and surprise. It was a slaughter. We destroyed 11 before the rest could escape. This is how you win a war." The bomber crews flying over Frankfurt that day noticed something amazing. German fighter attacks, which usually began far from the target and continued during the bomb run, barely happened. A few small attacks occurred, but the mass formations that had destroyed previous raids never appeared. The new fighter tactics had stopped them first. But the real test came in February 1944 with Operation Argument, soon called Big Week. General Karl Spaatz, commanding United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, designed the operation as bait. American bombers would strike German aircraft factories that were so important the Luftwaffe would have no choice but to defend them with everything they had. The goal was not mainly to destroy the factories, though that would be helpful. The goal was to force the Luftwaffe into a big battle of attrition against American fighters that now outnumbered, outperformed, and outfought their German enemies. February 20th, 1944. Clear skies over Germany for the first time in weeks. Over 1,000 American bombers from England and Italy, escorted by hundreds of fighters, launched against 12 different aircraft production facilities, the largest single-day air armada in history. Major Erich Hartmann, Germany's top ace with 352 victories, watched the American formation fly overhead and realized immediately what was happening. "This is not a bombing raid," he told his squadron. "This is a fighter battle with bombers as the excuse. They want us to come up and fight, and we have no choice." The Luftwaffe responded with everything available. Over 900 German fighters scrambled to intercept the American formations. The sky over central Germany erupted into the largest air battle in history. Contrails from thousands of planes crossed the sky from sea level to 40,000 feet. But this time, American fighters were not tied defensively to bomber formations. They ranged across hundreds of miles of German airspace, attacking German fighters wherever they found them. On the ground, taking off, forming up, or approaching the bombers. The Mustangs and Thunderbolts hunted without stopping. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group encountered a formation of Messerschmitt 262 jets, Germany's new revolutionary fighter, taking off from an airfield near Leipzig. The jets were fast and deadly once in the air, but taking off, they were vulnerable. Drew dove from 30,000 feet, screaming through flak, and opened fire on the lead jet as it lifted off the runway. The jet exploded. He destroyed a second jet before it could gain speed. The other jets scattered. Drew's combat report became famous. The jets are dangerous in the air, but they must take off and land like any plane. Catch them there, and they burn like any other. The first day of Big Week cost the Americans 21 bombers and 4 fighters. By the standards of Schweinfurt 3 months earlier, this was a miracle. But German losses were terrible. Over 50 fighters destroyed. More importantly, 38 pilots were killed or seriously wounded. For the next 5 days, whenever the weather allowed, the attacks continued. American bombers struck Regensburg, Brunswick, Schweinfurt again, Gotha, Augsburg. Each raid brought hundreds of bombers and fighters. Each raid forced the Luftwaffe to respond. Each raid cost Germany fighters and pilots it could not replace. Major Heinz Baer, a German ace with over 220 victories, described the impossible situation in his diary. "We shoot down bombers, but the fighters are everywhere. We form up, and they attack us before we can attack. We land to refuel, and they strafe the airfield. We take off, and they are waiting. There is no escape. For every bomber we destroy, we lose 2 fighters and pilots." By February 25th, when Big Week ended, the numbers told the story. American losses: 226 heavy bombers, 28 escort fighters, about 2,600 casualties. These were serious losses, but American production and training replaced them within a month. German losses: over 350 fighters destroyed, another 90 damaged beyond repair. Even worse, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 100 pilots killed and over 50 seriously wounded. These pilots had over 3 years of combat experience. They were irreplaceable. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Ellerfeld, commander of a Jagdgeschwader fighter wing, wrote in his report to Galland, "We are losing the most experienced men. The new pilots cannot survive against the American fighters. Within 3 months, we will have aircraft, but no one capable of flying them in combat." But Doolittle's strategy went beyond air combat. The second part of his plan, strafing attacks on German airfields and infrastructure, was just as devastating. Every day, as American fighters returned from escort missions, they would drop to low altitude and attack targets of opportunity across Germany. Airfields suffered especially heavy damage. Fighters parked in the open, planes in maintenance, fuel trucks, hangars, all became targets. German pilots described coming back from missions to find their home airfields under attack, forced to go to other bases or land while being strafed. Major Gunther R., a Luftwaffe ace with 275 victories, described the psychological effect. "We used to feel safe on our own airfields. Nowhere is safe. The Americans attack morning, noon, and evening. Pilots survive combat only to die on the ground. Mechanics are killed servicing planes. Fuel trucks explode. We cannot keep operations going under constant attack." The effect started to show in March 1944 when the 8th Air Force launched its first major raids on Berlin itself. On March 6th, 730 bombers escorted by 800 fighters struck the German capital. The symbolic and strategic importance of Berlin meant the Luftwaffe had to respond with full force. They did. Over 150 German fighters engaged the American formations. The battle raged across hundreds of miles as fighters clashed, while bombers pressed toward their targets. When the count was done, the Americans had lost 69 bombers and 11 fighters. The Germans lost 160 planes destroyed and another 50 damaged. The pilot losses were huge. Nearly 70 experienced fighter pilots killed or wounded in a single day. For the Luftwaffe, it was a disaster they could not recover from. Captain Johannes, group commander of the first group, Jagdgeschwader 52, survived the March 6th battle and wrote that evening, "Today I watched the German fighter force die. We threw everything at them, and it was not enough. They shot us down faster than we could shoot them down. Their losses are temporary. Ours are permanent. The war is lost." Between January and May 1944, the total losses became unbearable for the Luftwaffe. German fighter pilot losses went over 1,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. This was nearly 1/4 of all fighter pilots available at the start of this period. More importantly, the losses were heaviest among the most experienced pilots. The veterans, the men with dozens or hundreds of victories, the squadron and group commanders, the instructors, were systematically killed. They died because they were the most aggressive, because they led from the front, because they tried to protect the inexperienced newcomers. 28 German aces with over 30 kills died between January and May. 8 aces with over 100 kills were killed or captured. Each of these men represented years of training and combat experience. Each was literally irreplaceable. The training system could not keep up. In 1944, Germany graduated 29,000 new fighter pilots, but training time had fallen to just 110 hours total flight time by mid-year, with some late-war pilots getting as little as 50 hours. American pilots in the same period received over 450 hours of training, including 250 hours in their combat aircraft. Major Hans Philipp, a German ace with 206 victories, described the new pilot situation in his final letter home before being killed in action in October 1943. The boys arrive at the squadron unable to fly in formation properly. They do not understand tactical principles. They panic under fire. In combat with experienced American pilots flying better aircraft, they survive 1, maybe 2 missions, then they die. We cannot teach them fast enough. There is no time. The difference in aircraft production told another part of the story. In the first 6 months of 1944, American factories produced over 22,000 fighter aircraft. German factories, even though dispersed to avoid bombing, produced 9,000 fighters. The number advantage alone was overwhelming, but the better quality of American planes made the difference decisive. The P51 Mustang was clearly better than the Messerschmitt 109 and Focke-Wulf 109 in most combat situations. It was faster, had more range, performed better at high altitude, and could turn and maneuver as well or better. Colonel Hubert Zkay, commanding the 56th Fighter Group flying P-47 Thunderbolts, explained the combined effect. "We have more fighters, better trained pilots, better tactics, and unlimited fuel and ammunition. The Germans have brave men flying good planes, but they cannot keep them supplied or properly maintained. Courage cannot overcome such disadvantages forever." By April 1944, the transformation was complete. German fighter strength, measured in operational planes and pilots, had fallen to less than 60% of January levels. More importantly, the quality of the force had fallen catastrophically. The veteran formations that had destroyed bomber raids in October 1943 no longer existed. The new Luftwaffe mostly had inexperienced pilots flying planes with too little fuel, not enough ammunition, and minimal maintenance. They faced American formations that were growing larger and more confident with every mission. On May 8, 1944, the 8th Air Force sent nearly 900 bombers to attack oil refineries and rail yards across Germany. Over 750 escort fighters went with them. Not a single German fighter rose to intercept. The Luftwaffe, for the first time, gave up the sky without a fight. General Galland reported to Goering that day, "The fighter force is destroyed. We have planes but cannot fly them for lack of fuel. We have pilots, but most cannot fight well. The Americans attack at will. We can no longer contest their air superiority. The strategic impact became clear on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 missions on the first day of the invasion. Luftwaffe fighters flew fewer than 300 missions. The difference allowed Allied ground attack planes to destroy German positions while bombers isolated the battlefield. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France, sent an urgent message to his wife on June 10th. The enemy has complete air superiority. Our troops cannot move in daylight without being attacked. Our supplies cannot reach the front. Without air cover, we cannot hold the invasion beaches. The transformation from October 1943 to June 1944 was shocking. 6 months earlier, the Luftwaffe had seemed able to slowly destroy the American bomber attacks. Now they were almost gone as a fighting force over Western Europe. The numbers from those 6 important months show the total destruction. Between January and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 2,500 fighter pilots killed or seriously wounded in combat over Germany. This was about 75% of all fighter pilots available at the start of that period. American losses in the same time were around 420 fighter pilots killed or missing, and 7,000 bomber crew casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. These losses were serious but could be replaced because of American training and aircraft production. The kill ratios had completely reversed. In October 1943, German fighters were destroying American bombers at a rate of 20 bombers for every German fighter lost. By May 1944, American fighters were destroying German fighters at a ratio of 4 to 1. But more than the numbers, the psychological change was total. German pilots who had started 1944 confident of victory now flew missions expecting to die. American pilots who had feared German fighters now hunted them aggressively. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group, who ended the war with about 20 aerial victories, described the change. In January, we were glad when the Germans did not attack. By March, we were disappointed when they ran away. By May, we were frustrated because there were so few left to fight. The transformation was complete. The success of Doolittle's strategy proved his gamble right, but it created an interesting historical twist. His decision, first opposed by many bomber commanders as reckless abandonment, actually saved the bombing campaign. By destroying German fighters before they could attack bombers, aggressive fighter tactics protected bombers better than defensive escorts ever could. General Spaatz agreed in a June 1944 assessment. General Doolittle's choice to let fighters hunt was the key factor in winning air superiority. We destroyed more German fighters in 4 months than in the previous 2 years. The secret was letting fighters hunt instead of forcing them to defend. Major General Frederick Anderson, who had replaced Yeager as commander of bomber operations, admitted his first opposition had been wrong. I believed keeping fighters close to bombers was the only way to protect them. I was wrong. Killing enemy fighters before they attack is far more effective than killing them during attacks. General Doolittle understood this. I did not. The tactical revolution went beyond doctrine and completely changed how air warfare was understood. Before Doolittle's January directive, escort fighters were seen as extra protection for bomber defensive weapons. After Big Week, fighters were understood as the main weapon for gaining air superiority, with bombers serving partly as bait to bring enemy fighters into battle. This understanding would shape Air Force doctrine for many decades. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, and every later conflict would use lessons from early 1944. Air superiority comes from destroying enemy fighters first, not from protecting friendly planes after they are attacked. But the human cost of the strategy was very high. Over 10,000 American airmen died in the skies over Europe in the first half of 1944. The bomber crews who flew missions day after day, knowing each mission might be their last, showed amazing courage. The fighter pilots who accepted the mission of hunting German fighters deep over enemy territory showed remarkable skill and aggression. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group, who survived to become the second highest-scoring American ace in Europe, with 27 victories, reflected on the cost years later. We talk about tactics and strategy and numbers, but what really happened was thousands of young men climbed into planes every day and flew into combat, knowing many would not return. We won because we had more courage, more skill, better planes, better tactics, and better leadership. We won because Jimmy Doolittle understood that protecting bombers meant killing fighters, not staying close to bombers. By August 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter force had effectively stopped existing as a coherent defensive organization. Individual groups kept fighting with great courage and occasional success. New jet aircraft, the Messerschmitt 262, showed revolutionary potential. But the systematic destruction of the pilot force in the first half of the year could not be fixed. Germany produced over 36,000 fighters in 1944, the highest annual total of the war. But there were not enough trained pilots to fly them, not enough fuel to train the pilots who existed, not enough experienced leaders to create effective tactics, and not enough time to rebuild what had been lost. Captain Erich Rudolfer, one of the few German aces to survive the war with over 220 victories, summed up the situation. We had planes in abundance by late 1944, modern fighters, even jets, but we had no experienced pilots to fly them. The Americans had killed all the good pilots in the spring. The war was already lost by the time our production reached its peak. The success of Doolittle's strategy created a model for modern air warfare that is still important today. Air superiority cannot be won by defense alone. It needs aggressive action against enemy planes and infrastructure. Technology matters, but the quality of training matters even more. Having more planes is helpful only if combined with better trained pilots. Most importantly, leaders willing to challenge traditional rules and take risks can achieve results far greater than small improvements to old methods. Doolittle's decision to change the sign on Key Obtainer's wall was not just symbolic. It showed a complete rethink of how fighters should be used. The bomber crews, who at first feared Doolittle's tactics as abandonment, came to understand and respect the strategy. Technical Sergeant Andy Rooney, a Stars and Stripes reporter who flew bombing missions to cover the air war, wrote in June 1944, "The fighter pilots saved us by leaving us." It sounds strange, but it was true. When the fighters stayed close, the Germans attacked anyway. When they flew ahead and hunted, the Germans could not reach us. The best defense was a good offense. General Doolittle understood this. We did not. He was right. By the time of the Normandy invasion, Allied air forces had total air supremacy over Western Europe. German planes still flew, but in such small numbers and with such limited effectiveness that they could not challenge Allied air operations. The invasion succeeded in large part because soldiers could fight without fear of enemy air attacks. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, noted this in his post-invasion assessment. The air forces gave us the one thing we absolutely needed for success. They gave us freedom to operate without enemy planes interfering. General Doolittle's fighter tactics destroyed the Luftwaffe when destruction was most needed. History will remember this as one of the most decisive campaigns of the war. The transformation from October 1943 to June 1944 was one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. In October, the Luftwaffe was winning the battle of attrition over Germany. American bomber losses were impossible to sustain. The strategic bombing campaign seemed doomed. 6 months later, the Luftwaffe was shattered. American bombers flew with minimal losses, and Allied ground forces prepared to invade France under full air cover. The change was so complete and so fast that German commanders could hardly understand what had happened. General Galland, in his post-war memoirs, identified the turning point exactly. When the Americans changed their fighter tactics in January 1944, they won the air war. We could fight American bombers, but we could not fight their fighters and bombers at the same time. Once they allowed the fighters to hunt us, we were finished. The end was only a matter of time. The final numbers of the campaign show its overwhelming success. Between January and December 1944, The Luftwaffe lost over 4,000 fighter pilots killed in action over Germany. American and British fighters destroyed over 11,000 German fighters in the air and on the ground. German fighter pilot training time fell from 200 hours in 1943 to less than 100 hours by late 1944. American losses in the same period were about 750 fighter pilots and 16,000 bomber crew casualties. These were serious losses, but American training schools graduated over 35,000 new pilots in 1944, and American factories produced over 63,000 military aircraft. The kill ratio in air combat changed completely. In 1943, Luftwaffe fighters had about 1.2 kills for every loss. In 1944, the ratio reversed, with American fighters scoring 3.7 kills for every loss. By 1945, the ratio went over 7 to 1. But perhaps the most important number was pilot experience. In January 1944, the average German fighter pilot had over 200 hours of combat experience in January 1944. By January 1945, the average was under 50 hours. The Luftwaffe had not run out of planes or fuel, although both were limited. It had run out of trained pilots who could fight effectively. Doolittle's controversial decision had done exactly what General Arnold wanted. It destroyed the Luftwaffe as a fighting force before the Normandy invasion. It showed that aggressive offensive fighter tactics worked better than defensive escort tactics. It proved that winning air superiority meant killing enemy fighters, not just protecting friendly bombers. The human cost was high. Over 26,000 American airmen died in the skies over Europe during World War II, more than the entire United States Marine Corps lost in the Pacific. The 8th Air Force alone had over 47,000 casualties. These men won air superiority through courage, skill, and sacrifice. For German fighter pilots, the campaign was disastrous. Thousands of young men, many still teenagers, climbed into cockpits, knowing survival was unlikely. They fought bravely and skillfully against overwhelming odds until death claimed them. The aces, the veterans, the squadron leaders, all nearly died in combat or were captured. Few survived the war. Major Erich Hartmann, the war's top ace with 352 victories, survived only because he fought mainly on the Eastern Front. After the war, he admitted what had happened in the West. The Americans destroyed the Luftwaffe over Germany in 1944. They had better planes, more planes, better trained pilots, and superior tactics. We fought bravely, but we were overwhelmed. General Doolittle's strategy was brilliant. It cost us everything. In January 1944, when Doolittle ordered the sign changed in Kiaptener's office, many thought it was madness. By June, it was recognized as genius. The first duty of fighters really was to destroy enemy fighters. Everything else came from that principle. The Berlin raids, the destruction of German infrastructure, and the protection of ground forces during the invasion all became everything was possible because American fighters had destroyed the Luftwaffe in just 4 months of intense combat. What seemed reckless at first turned out to be the only way to win. 70 years later, military historians studying the air campaign over Europe always point to Doolittle's January directive as the turning point. One decision, one change in tactics, one general's courage to challenge old rules completely changed the air war. The bombers came back safely, not because fighters stayed close, but because fighters destroyed German fighters before they could attack. The surprising truth that attacking provides better protection than defending became official doctrine. Air forces around the world learned this lesson. Control of the air comes from destroying enemy planes aggressively, not just defending your own. Lieutenant General James Doolittle retired from the Air Force in 1946 after commanding the 8th, 15th, and 12th Air Forces during the war. He received many awards, including the Medal of Honor, multiple Distinguished Service Medals, and honorary knighthood from Britain. But of all his achievements, he said the fighter directive was his most important decision. In a 1970s interview, Doolittle said about that January day, "Changing the fighter tactics was the hardest decision I made. Bomber commanders opposed it. Bomber crews were afraid. Some fighter pilots thought it was suicide. But I knew from my experience as a fighter pilot that attacking wins air battles. You cannot win by defending. You win by attacking." The losses were terrible, but they would have been worse if we had stayed defensive. We won because we accepted risk and attacked aggressively. The sign Doolittle, ordered removed from Kiaptaner's wall in January. 1944 now sits in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. Next to it is the replacement sign. Together, they tell the story of a tactical revolution that won air supremacy in Europe. For bomber crews who survived, many said Doolittle's decision saved their lives. At first, they had opposed the change, thinking that fighters leaving them to hunt Germans elsewhere was abandonment. Experience taught them differently. The best way to protect bombers was to destroy enemy fighters before they could attack. For the Luftwaffe, Doolittle's order was the beginning of the end. In October 1943, they were winning the air war of attrition. 6 months later, they were destroyed as an effective fighting force. The combination of American numbers, better technology, superior training, and aggressive tactics was too much to handle. The campaign from January to June 1944 shows military principles that still matter today. Attacking wins over defending when both sides have similar strength. Better training produces better results even when outnumbered. Technology combined with smart tactics creates decisive advantage. Leaders willing to challenge old rules and take risks achieve strategic results. Most importantly, winning air superiority means destroying enemy fighters, not just protecting your own aircraft. This surprising truth, understood by Doolittle and proven in combat over Germany in 1944, is still the basis of air combat doctrine worldwide. The story of how one general's order to change a sign on a wall led to destroying the Luftwaffe in weeks is really a story about understanding air combat. Doolittle knew fighters are offensive weapons whose main job is to kill enemy fighters. Using them defensively wastes their potential and gives the enemy the initiative. Bomber crews who first feared his tactics later saw their value. German pilots who resisted them learned their effectiveness too late. Military aviation learned lessons that shaped air warfare for generations. On June 6, 1944, when Allied forces stormed Normandy beaches under clear skies with no German aircraft, Doolittle's strategy had succeeded completely. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe for 5 years, destroyed air forces from Poland to France, and bombed London into rubble, was gone. American and British fighters had hunted them to extinction. One tactical decision, one change in doctrine, one general's courage to challenge conventional wisdom had achieved what years of bombing could not. The Luftwaffe was destroyed not by hitting factories, but by attacking fighters. Not by defending bombers, but by hunting aggressively. Not by playing defensive, but by taking the offensive. The sign came down on January 6, 1944. 6 months later, the Luftwaffe was finished. The link between those two events is clear, measurable, and undeniable. One general's daring strategy destroyed the enemy air force in weeks, won air supremacy over Europe, and ensured the invasion that would free the continent succeeded. History judges Jimmy Doolittle's decision to change fighter tactics as one of the most important command decisions of World War II. 2. Not because it was complex or technical, but because it was the right choice. The first duty of fighters is to destroy enemy fighters.